Before you hear what happened inside the place called the Land Between the Lakes, understand one thing. People who tell these stories don't want to be believed. They want to be left alone. But tonight, we open the door they've been trying to keep shut. There are stories people tell around campfires that fade as soon as the fire burns out. And then there are the other stories that don't behave like legends, that feel too sharp, too detailed, too stubborn to dissolve into rumor, stories that follow people across decades, passed in whispers by those who swore they'd never speak of them again, deep inside the region known as the Land Between the Lakes, LBL. One story has survived longer than the families who once lived there. It begins with a simple camping trip in the early 1980s, a family of 4 driving their motorhome onto a quiet piece of shoreline to spend a peaceful spring night. A father, a mother, a teenage son, a 5-year-old girl. Nothing unusual, nothing frightening. Just the woods, the lake breeze, the kind of darkness that feels comforting when you don't know any better. But something was already watching them from the tree line. Not a person, not a bear, not anything that belonged to the modern world. As the sun dropped behind the canopy, the air changed. The forest grew silent too quickly, as if the woods themselves had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe out. The family never noticed. They cooked dinner, laughed, settled into their RV. The little girl fell asleep with a stuffed toy in her arms. Outside, something circled. It moved with weight, but not clumsiness. It tapped its claws lightly along the siding, tested the thin frame of the RV with deliberate pressure, breathed against the window, too slow, too controlled, too high off the ground to be anything normal. The father heard something once, lifted his head, listened, but convinced himself it was raccoons. When rescuers arrived the next morning, they didn't find a campsite anymore. They found destruction. The door of the RV had been torn away entirely, peeled off the hinges like foil. Inside, the scene barely resembled a place where people had lived hours earlier. Blood covered the cushions, walls, cabinets. Furniture had been ripped apart, claw marks, deep, wide, impossibly spaced, gouged through metal and wood. The father, the mother, the teenage son, all dead inside, torn apart in ways no animal native to Kentucky or Tennessee could possibly manage. And the little girl was missing. Search teams spread through the woods, calling her name, clinging to the desperate hope that she had escaped, that maybe she had run, maybe she was hiding. They found her hanging 10 feet off the ground in a tree, a small leg, a small hand, a white sock dangling from a branch, clumps of coarse dark fur jammed between her fingers, as if she had tried to grab whatever took her. The officer who spotted her screamed, and the others ran toward him, only to stop and stare at something none of them would ever forget. The coroner would later say, the claw spacing didn't match a bear, mountain lion, wolf, dog, anything. The bite radius belonged to no cataloged predator. Whatever had done this wasn't recognized by science. Before any of those officers could process what they'd seen, unmarked vehicles rolled into the clearing. Men in dark clothing stepped out. No insignia, no introductions, no explanations. They ordered every local responder to leave immediately. Within hours, the site was erased, scrubbed clean, the RV hauled away, blood removed, soil raked, no trace left, no public report, no newspaper article, no official acknowledgement the family ever existed. But secrets like that don't stay buried. Not in a place like LBL. Two traumatized officers showed up at a gas station before sunrise, uniforms stained with blood, shaking so violently the clerk thought they'd been shot at. One vomited on the pavement. The other whispered, "There's nothing in this world that could have done that," before falling silent. Later, one of them returned and told the clerk that the saliva sample couldn't be matched. "Closest thing was wolf," he said quietly. "But wolves don't live here. Not like this." Yet the story didn't start with that family. They weren't the beginning, only the moment when the rest of the world was forced to notice what had always hunted those woods long before the recreation area existed, long before the lakes swallowed the old towns, long before the government forced out hundreds of families. The original inhabitants, the Shawnee, warned outsiders not to linger in certain valleys after dark. They spoke of something that lived between worlds, something that walked upright like a man but hunted like a wolf, something that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. French trappers in the 1700s had their own name for it, loup-garou, a wolf man. Generations of settlers reported livestock torn apart in ways too violent for any known predator. Hunters described gutted deer, bones shattered, carcasses dragged through impossible terrain. Farmers told stories of tall, fur-covered shapes standing at the edges of their fields at night, too still to be bears, too silent to be men. But the deeper forests, the true interior, were avoided. Even experienced hunters refused to go there. The place felt claimed, occupied, watched. When the modern era arrived, when roads and dams and signs were built, the stories didn't disappear. They intensified. People vanished. Trails went quiet. And every time someone tried to talk, someone else shut them down. The truth lived in the shadows, the fear lived in the people, and the creature lived in the forest. Still watching, still hunting, still waiting for whoever was foolish enough to step inside its territory. No public report, no newspaper article, no official acknowledgement the family ever existed. But secrets like that don't stay buried. Not in a place like LBL. People who lived near the edges of the land, between the lakes, didn't need science to tell them something was wrong there. You could feel it the moment you crossed the bridge. Hunters who'd spent their entire lives in the woods said LBL didn't behave like normal wilderness. The air was too still. The trees grew too thick in some places and too open in others, like paths crushed repeatedly by something heavy. The deeper you went, the fewer animals you saw. Squirrels vanished. Birds fell silent. Deer tracks stopped appearing altogether. It was as if the forest itself wanted everything else gone. A former police officer named Roberts, years after the 1980s tragedy, decided he wanted answers. He'd heard the whispers from other officers, the ones who poured coffee into shaking hands, the ones who had nightmares they refused to describe, the ones who quit the force quietly after patrols near the park. Every cop who had reason to patrol near LBL carried a story behind their eyes. So Roberts went himself. He wasn't inexperienced or easily frightened. He had dealt with violent scenes, armed suspects, unpredictable criminals. The woods didn't intimidate him. At least that's what he believed. The first thing he noticed when he started walking the old trails wasn't sound. It was the lack of it. No wind, no rustling, no distant calls. Just silence that pressed against him like a weight. Trails twisted into thick brush as if something large had forced its way through again and again. Other sections were unnaturally open, like natural corridors, created by an animal that preferred to run on 2 legs, not 4. He heard faint footsteps once, leaves crunching in a slow, deliberate pattern behind him. When he turned around, nothing stood there. But something moved again, minutes later, this time to his left, then his right, always circling, always keeping its distance, not stalking out of hunger, monitoring him out of curiosity. He used a predator call, a dying rabbit scream, to lure coyotes, thinking he could observe reactions. But what answered wasn't coyotes. 3 heavy bodies began crashing through the brush toward him from different angles. Not small animals, not scavengers. Something big. He sprinted back to his van, slammed the door, locked it, turned the headlights on, just in time to see multiple sets of green eyes reflecting back at him from the tree line high off the ground. Motionless, watching. It was the first time in his adult life he felt hunted. And yet, that wasn't the moment that changed him. The moment that changed him came days later, when he tried again. He hiked deeper this time, into a place where even experienced locals refused to go. Forgotten cemeteries sat half swallowed by earth. Stone foundations from 1800s cabins lay twisted under vines. Trees bent in unnatural directions, curved as if something large pushed them aside instead of growing around them. He found drag marks crossing a dry creek bed, deep grooves in the soil, like something had pulled a body through the mud. No animal carcass followed, no tracks, just the single sign that something strong enough to drag a full-grown deer or a man had passed through. And then he saw it. He didn't hear it first. He didn't smell it. He didn't sense it. He simply looked up and realized something was already there. It stood between 2 trees, tall enough that its shoulders nearly brushed the lower branches. Completely upright, completely still, covered in dark fur that blended so perfectly into the shadows that he didn't understand how long it had been watching him. The head was wrong for a bear, too narrow, too forward, ending in a muzzle with a blunt, powerful jaw. The ears rose to points. The arms hung lower than a human's. But the hands, those were hands, not paws, clawed, but shaped like something that could grab, pull, tear. Its chest rose slowly, each breath deep and controlled. And it was staring at him, not confused, not startled, not afraid, just assessing him. Roberts froze, unable to speak, unable to breathe. His body reacted before his brain did, every instinct buried in human evolution screaming the same thing: predator. When he finally moved, the creature didn't flinch. It didn't charge. It didn't roar. It simply turned its head slightly, as if confirming he was real, then bounded away with impossible speed. A blur of motion that zigzagged through the trees, the kind of movement no human would survive if it chose to chase. Roberts reached the spot where it had stood and placed his palm against the tree trunk. Its handprint sat nearly a foot above his reach. The earth below was disturbed in a wide pattern, as if something extremely heavy had leapt, landed, and launched again. He returned to town pale and shaking. When he told locals what he saw, they didn't laugh. They didn't question him. They didn't even look surprised. They simply reacted with a level of fear so familiar, it was almost routine. One fisherman told him he'd seen something similar, crouched at the shoreline tearing into a fish. When the creature realized he was watching, it stood to its full height, and the fisherman saw water dripping from fur that hung off a chest shaped like a man's, but built like an apex predator. It had walked toward his boat until he sped away as fast as the motor could push him. Another man told him that every time people go missing in LBL, authorities blame wild dogs, even when the bite radius doesn't match any known canine, even when the bodies are dragged miles, even when entire torsos go missing. A restaurant worker said her cousin vanished near the Moss Creek site, the same area rumored to have been shut down because of the 1980s attack. No body was ever found. Rangers told the family no foul play, but the worker said her uncle found tufts of dark fur and parallel claw marks carved into a fallen log. The more Roberts listened, the clearer the picture became. The stories weren't isolated. They weren't exaggerated. They weren't random superstition from bored locals. They were consistent, detailed, generational. And every story pointed to the same terrifying reality. Something lived in those woods. Something intelligent. Something territorial. Something that understood humans the way humans understand prey. And that creature didn't fear people. It studied them, monitored them, followed them. The woods weren't empty, they were cleared by something powerful enough to dominate an entire ecosystem. And when people stepped too far into its territory, they weren't exploring. They were trespassing. Roberts had gone into LBL looking for answers. Instead, he found something looking back. The strange thing was this: for all the stories Roberts heard, for all the warnings, for all the fear wrapped around LBL like fog, nobody ever treated the creature as a legend. Not once. They didn't call it Bigfoot, didn't call it a monster, didn't call it a ghost or a spirit. They called it that thing in the woods, with a tone people only use when the danger is real enough to kill you. Locals didn't speculate. They avoided. They refused to engage. They didn't debate whether it existed. They behaved as if it absolutely did. And they acted like the worst mistake a person could make was acknowledging it. Roberts didn't understand that part, not at first. He thought the silence came from embarrassment or fear of ridicule or local superstition. But the more he pushed, the more he realized something else was happening. Something deeper, something instinctive, something almost ritualistic. People acted like speaking about the creature was an invitation, as if naming it gave it permission to notice you, or worse, to remember you. One fisherman told him exactly that without meaning to. They were sitting at a marina bench, sun going down behind the trees, and the man spoke softly without looking at him. You start talking about the thing, and it learns you're talking. Roberts laughed nervously, expecting a grin or a wink. The man didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He didn't look away from the water. He just said, "It hears different than we do." And that was the end of the conversation. The man stood up, walked to his truck, and drove off without saying goodbye. When Roberts asked the same question in town, "Have you ever seen anything strange in those woods?" the reaction was always the same. In Grand Rivers, tension, fear, hostility. In Paducah, stories, memories, confessions told with the relief of distance. And the pattern became obvious. The closer you lived to LBL, the less you spoke about it. The investigator who eventually traveled there after Roberts noticed the same thing. He'd been researching LBL for years, reading the older stories, the colonial stories, the tribal warnings, the disappearances, the 1980s massacre, the government cover-ups, the missing hunters, the unexplained maulings, blamed on wild dogs. But research is one thing. Walking into the woods is another. When he first drove the trace, the long road cutting down the middle of LBL, he expected normal wilderness. He expected birds, deer, squirrels, snapping twigs, distant rustling, the natural chaos of forest life. Instead, he got silence. Not peaceful silence, predatory silence. A silence that felt like something was already watching him. He explored abandoned homesteads, swallowed by vines, graveyards forgotten under moss, and trails that disappeared into thick brush that looked recently disturbed. He found trees with claw marks too wide for bears, too deep for cougars. He found deer carcasses torn open in ways that didn't match natural predation. He found old campsites where fire pits still held charcoal, but everything around them looked wrong. Branches bent, brush crushed, circular patterns of disturbed soil, as if something stalked campers in the dark. The more he walked, the more he felt a presence around him. Not behind him, not beside him, around him. Every time he stopped, he had the unshakable sense that something stopped too. Every time he turned his head, he expected to see eyeshine between the trees. He saw shadows darting where no wind was blowing. He heard soft crunching in the distance, footsteps too heavy for raccoons, too controlled for deer. And he could feel the weight of the woods pressing in, as if the forest was waiting for him to cross some invisible line. But it wasn't until he approached DeMumbers Bay that everything changed. DeMumbers Bay had a reputation older than the internet. Stories of campers who woke to growls outside their tents, fishermen who refused to anchor there after dark, teenagers who dared each other to walk the shoreline at midnight and ran back. Pale and shaking, Roberts had warned him not to go there. "Whatever's in those woods," he said, "that's where it comes closest." The investigator didn't believe in cursed locations. He didn't believe in hotspots. He didn't believe in monsters that favored specific places. But the moment he stepped out of the vehicle at the edge of DeMumbers Bay, something primitive inside him stirred. The silence was wrong. The air too dense. The trees too still. He stood on the old, overgrown trail leading toward the water, listening for anything. Insects, frogs, distant bird song. But everything felt muted, dead, hollow. He played a predator call, the same dying rabbit recording that Roberts had used. The sound echoed unnaturally far across the bay, and something answered. Not with a howl, not with a roar, with movement, heavy, fast, coming from 3 different directions at once. The kind of movement no bear makes, no dog pack makes, no human could replicate. He sprinted back to the vehicle, slammed the door, locked it, and turned the headlights toward the woods. Green eyes. Not one, not two, several. High off the ground, staring, unmoving. The eyes didn't blink, didn't sway, didn't shift. Just watched with a cold, calculating intelligence that no wild animal possesses. He left Demumber's Bay that night convinced of one thing. There was more than one creature. But he didn't see the Dogman, not truly, until the afternoon he and his partner drove deeper into the northern woods, taking a road only hunters usually took, where the trees pressed tight around the asphalt and the shadows fell early. The investigator was looking out the passenger window when he saw something move between the trees. At first he thought it was a burned tree trunk, then a person. Then his brain caught up. It was neither. It stood upright, still, silent, tall enough that its head brushed low branches but didn't duck. Shoulders too broad for a human, arms too long, legs bent backward at the knee, like a canine's. And the head ended all possibility of misidentification. A wolf's face, but heavier, shorter muzzle, thicker jaw, eyes that weren't the eyes of an animal. They were the eyes of something that knew exactly what he was. It didn't flinch, didn't hide, didn't react with surprise. It simply watched him watching it. The vehicle jolted to a stop. Doors opened. Instinct overpowered reason. The investigator stepped out. His partner did the same. For one breathless moment, both men stared at the creature while it remained perfectly still, hand resting casually against a tree as though it had been waiting for them. And then it moved, not away from them, around them. A blur of dark fur leaping sideways between the trees, zigzagging with speed. No human could track. Branches snapped. Brush exploded. The forest swallowed it instantly. They ran to the tree where it had stood. The investigator reached up, placing his palm where he'd seen its hand. He couldn't reach it, not even close. Whatever they saw that day wasn't a bear, wasn't a misidentified man, wasn't a hoax, it was real. And from that moment on, the story stopped being about sightings and theories and old legends. It became personal. Because once a predator looks directly into your eyes, it never forgets you. It never made sense how something that large could vanish so completely, but that was the first thing they learned about the creature. It did not disappear because it was fast, it disappeared because the forest cooperated with it. The investigator stood there, palms still pressed against the rough bark, trying to make sense of the scale of what he'd just seen. His partner paced in a tight, panicked circle behind him, muttering under his breath, voice trembling with adrenaline. Neither of them wanted to say it out loud. Naming something makes it real. And both of them were clinging to the fading hope that maybe, somehow, they had misunderstood what they saw. But the forest didn't let them lie to themselves. Branches that had been untouched minutes earlier were now bent and cracked at angles. Impossible for deer. Deep impressions in the ground, pressed into the leaf litter, as if something heavy had launched itself sideways. The air felt electrified, thick with static. Like the moment before lightning hits, it wasn't fear. It wasn't adrenaline. It was presence. The feeling of an apex predator choosing not to kill you. Not because it couldn't, because it didn't want to. Not yet. That realization hollowed the investigator from the inside out. They walked back toward the vehicle because there was nothing else their bodies knew how to do. Instinct overrode logic. They weren't talking. They weren't thinking. They were simply trying to get distance between themselves and the thing that had been standing so close they could hear its breathing if they replayed the memory. But even once they were back in the car, doors shut, windows locked, the feeling didn't leave. If anything, it grew heavier. He started the engine. The hum was too loud. The headlights felt too bright. The forest looked too black. They drove. Slow at first, then faster, then even faster. Gravel spitting under the tires, the thick trees rushing past in streaks of green and shadow. The investigator's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. His partner kept looking back at the rear-view mirror even though he didn't want to. When they reached the trace, the main road, something strange happened. They both exhaled at exactly the same moment, like a weight had snapped off their chests. But it wasn't relief. It was the realization that whatever lived in the forest stayed in the forest, at least for now. They didn't talk on the drive out, didn't look at each other, didn't dare break the silence, not because they didn't want to, because talking about it felt like waking it up again, but the feeling didn't go away. They drove past the last tree line before Grand Rivers, and still it clung to them, tension crawling along their nerves, a pressure at the back of the skull, a sensation like someone was standing just out of sight, watching the car pull away. Only when they reached the first street light of town did the world finally feel normal again, but normal didn't feel comforting. Normal felt fake, like a thin mask stretched over something waiting underneath. They stopped at a small store to grab food, neither hungry, both pretending to be fine. The woman at the counter asked if they'd been out near the woods. The investigator said yes before he could stop himself. Her smile froze, then faded. She reached for his items more slowly, eyes locked on him like she was searching for something in his expression. "You shouldn't be out there after dark," she said quietly. Not as advice, as warning. He asked why. She didn't blink. "It listens." He didn't ask anything else after that. Back in the parking lot, the investigator leaned against the car, staring at the tree line in the distance. The sun was going down again, the sky turning that same washed metallic blue it had been earlier, the color that made the trees look like jagged silhouettes instead of wood and bark. His partner stepped beside him. "You know it wasn't alone," he said. The investigator swallowed hard. "I know." The silence stretched between them. Then his partner said the thing neither of them wanted to admit. "It let us see it." And that was worse than anything else, because predators hide from prey, they stalk from shadows. They wait for the right moment to strike. But this creature had stepped into the open, not by accident, by choice. It wanted to be seen. It wanted them to know it was there. And creatures that want to be seen aren't running from you. They're warning you. That night, back at the condo, the investigator lay awake staring at the ceiling. Every sound felt amplified. Air conditioner hum, pipes shifting, a car passing outside. But one sound cut through everything. A single thud, soft, from outside the window. He sat up instantly, held his breath. Another thud. Heavier, closer. He moved to the window, heart pounding, palms sweating, every muscle in his body screaming not to look. The parking lot was empty, silent, still. But the feeling wasn't. It wrapped around him like a cold hand, something unseen, something patient, something that didn't have to be physically present to make itself known. He backed away from the glass. He didn't sleep. The next morning they packed without speaking, moving slowly, almost reverently, like people cleaning up after a funeral. They didn't say they were leaving for safety. They didn't have to. But before pulling onto the highway, the investigator looked back one last time at the tree line beyond the bridge. He didn't see movement, didn't see eyes, didn't see anything out of place. But it didn't matter. He knew. And somewhere in the thick, dark heart of LBL, it knew too. Creatures like that don't forget faces, or scents, or people who step too deep into their territory. The investigator left the forest. But the forest didn't leave him, it never does. He tried to convince himself that once he crossed into another state, the feeling would fade, that the dread clinging to his ribs would loosen, that whatever lived in those woods would stay behind, confined to its territory like any natural animal. But dread isn't tied to geography. Dread follows memory. 2 hours into the drive, his partner finally spoke. The first real sentence since leaving Grand Rivers. "You know there's no going back there," he said, staring ahead at the highway. "Not for you, not for me, not for anyone who's seen what we've seen." The investigator didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Both of them knew the truth. Once you recognize a predator, you don't unsee it. And once a predator recognizes you, you are never a stranger again. They reached a gas station near the Kentucky border. It was bright, full of people, full of noise. Everything the forest wasn't. Yet when the investigator stepped out of the car, he caught himself scanning the tree line behind the building before walking inside. No trees moved. No shadows shifted. Nothing watched him. But the habit was already carved into his brain. He grabbed coffee, didn't taste it, didn't need to. His partner stood beside him at the counter, and for a moment they looked like two men on a normal road trip. Tired, silent, maybe hungover. But the cashier saw something else. "You boys all right?" she asked, eyes flicking between them. Her tone wasn't friendly. Curiosity. It was intuition. The kind people get when they recognize fear wrapped in silence. "Yeah," the partner said quickly. "Just passing through." She didn't look convinced. "Well, be careful out there," she said. "Strange things in the woods this time of year." They froze. Not because the words were unusual. People in rural areas say things like that all the time. But because she said it in a way that felt specific, like she wasn't talking about weather or animals or hunters, like she was talking about something with intention. They left without asking questions. On the drive, the investigator kept replaying the encounter in his head. The way the creature stood, the way its legs coiled before it moved, the way its arms hung unnervingly low, longer than human proportions allowed. The way its eyes didn't look surprised or threatened, but aware. None of it matched anything in the biological record. Nothing even close. He had seen wolves up close. He had seen bears. He had seen mountain lions. He had seen animals in every state of fear, hunger, aggression, curiosity. But nothing had ever looked at him the way that thing did. Not like prey, not like food, not like danger, but like an intruder, a trespasser. A man who'd walked into a place where man was never meant to be. He tried explaining it to himself in rational terms. Maybe it was a big dog, maybe a strange mutation, maybe his mind stitched the details wrong in the chaos. But denial only works when the memory is blurry. His wasn't. He remembered the sound, that heavy, concentrated silence that falls right before something steps forward. He remembered the weight of its stare. He remembered the unnatural smoothness of its leap into the ravine. He remembered its intelligence, its confidence, its absolute ownership of that forest. And the more he thought about it, the more one truth surfaced. That creature wasn't rare. It wasn't sick. It wasn't lost. It wasn't an anomaly. It belonged there. The forest bends around creatures like that. Animals avoid their territory. The air changes, the silence deepens. Something that moves like that doesn't hide because it fears humans. It hides because it chooses to. They arrived home late that night, road-weary and hollow. The investigator showered for nearly an hour, not because he was dirty, but because the constant sound of water made him feel less alone. He kept thinking the silence would creep back into the room if he stopped the water. When he finally lay down, sleep didn't come. He stared at the ceiling, the dark corners of the room feeling too deep, too watchful. 3 times he got up to check the window. Twice, he walked to the front door to make sure it was locked. Once he went outside, standing barefoot on the driveway, searching the darkness as if expecting something to step out. Nothing did, but the feeling remained. Not fear, not trauma. Recognition. Like he was standing on the wrong side of an invisible line, a line he had crossed once and could never uncross. Days passed. The feeling didn't fade. He snapped awake at night to phantom sounds, heavy footsteps that weren't there, slow breathing that wasn't real, the imagined rustle of leaves in a place without trees. His partner called 2 days later. "Do you feel it too?" The investigator didn't ask what he meant, because he did. The presence, the memory, the sense that something watched from a distance memory could not measure. He tried to explain it. "It's like it didn't stay in the woods." His partner corrected him. "It didn't need to?" And that was the moment the investigator realized something horrifying. Predators don't follow you physically. They follow you psychologically. Once you become aware of them, they live inside your instincts. They rewrite the way you look at shadows. They carve themselves into your sense of safety. They haunt the edges of silence. And that creature, whatever it was, had carved itself into him. Maybe it wasn't following, maybe it wasn't watching, maybe it didn't even remember him. But his body remembered. His instincts remembered. And deep down in the oldest part of his brain, the part shaped by thousands of years of human survival, something whispered a truth he didn't want to accept. What he saw in LBL wasn't unique. It wasn't alone. It wasn't an accident. It was a glimpse, a warning, a doorway into an older world, layered beneath the world we think we understand, and some doorways, once opened, never close again. The investigator thought that time would soften the memory, that distance would turn the encounter into something he could compartmentalize. A frightening moment, sure, but still a moment. Something finite, something with edges. But encounters like this don't stay inside the moment where they happened. They bleed, they seep into everyday life in ways that feel small at first, barely noticeable, almost rational. He caught himself avoiding wooded back roads on his commute. He closed the blinds earlier than he used to. He found himself listening for silence, not noise, every time he stepped outside. Silence, he learned, was no longer comforting. Silence meant potential. Silence meant possibility. Silence meant memory. His partner wasn't doing any better. They spoke less frequently, but when they did, the conversations were short, strained, always orbiting the same unspoken truth, that the forest had changed them, marked them, rewired them. One night, about a week after they returned, the investigator woke up suddenly, heart pounding, drenched in cold sweat. He didn't know why. No nightmare he could recall, no noise in the room, just a full-body jolt of instinct. He sat up, listened. Nothing. But the nothing was wrong. It was too complete, too sudden, too familiar. He got out of bed and walked to the window, pulling the blinds aside just an inch. His street was quiet. No wind, no cars, no rustling leaves. The world looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. Because that same silent density, the same impossible stillness he felt in LBL, settled over the neighborhood like a blanket. He didn't see anything, he didn't hear anything, but every hair on the back of his neck stood up. It took him nearly an hour to calm down, and when he finally fell asleep again, he dreamed not of the creature, but of the woods. The same trees, the same ravine, the same sense of being watched by something just out of sight. Waking up didn't relieve the feeling, it followed him into the day. At work, he caught himself glancing over his shoulder in brightly lit hallways. He avoided reflective surfaces because sometimes, only for a fraction of a second, he felt like he might see a shape standing behind him. Not a hallucination, not paranoia, an expectation, like his mind believed the creature should be there. He began studying maps of LBL obsessively, not consciously. He didn't choose to. He simply found himself scrolling satellite images late at night, tracing the routes they drove, the ravine, the dense brush where the creature disappeared. He zoomed into areas that were too dark to make out clearly. He stared at strange clearings. He followed game trails that didn't connect to anything. It wasn't research anymore. It was compulsion. His partner called again. This time, his voice was different, too calm, like he'd rehearsed what he was going to say. "Do you feel like it's waiting?" he asked. The investigator didn't answer at first. His partner continued, "Not here, not following us, just waiting. In general. Like it knows we'll come back." The investigator finally spoke. "I'm not going back." His partner hesitated. "You say that now." He wanted to argue, but the words caught in his throat. Because deep down, in the place where instinct overrides logic, he knew the same thing his partner did. Predators don't need to chase what they already control. They just wait for the right moment. The investigator tried therapy, tried distraction, tried routine. Nothing worked. Because this wasn't trauma. Not entirely. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was awareness. Awareness that something existed in the world that shouldn't. Awareness that something far older than humans still ruled certain places. Awareness that every story he dismissed as folklore had a foundation in something real. And awareness once gained cannot be undone. Weeks passed, then months. The silence stopped, following him so aggressively. The nights felt a little less heavy. The dreams faded, mostly. But the woods didn't leave him. He'd be driving on an ordinary day, sunlight streaming through the windshield, and suddenly, he'd remember the moment the forest fell silent, remember the creature's silhouette stepping through the trees, remember the way its eyes reflected the weak light. An image so vivid, so perfect, it could have happened minutes ago. One evening, as he sat on his porch, watching the sky shift from gold to blue, he realized something unsettling. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not because the creature had become less terrifying, far from it, but because the fear had settled into something else. Something colder. Something that felt like acceptance. As if his mind had built a new category of reality. A category where monsters exist. Not fantasy monsters, not supernatural beings. Predators. Real. Intelligent. Hidden. And out there, still moving through the woods with perfect silence. He ran a hand over his face and stared at the tree line at the edge of his property, its shadows deepening with dusk. For a moment, just one moment, he thought he saw movement. A shape, tall, still, between the trees. His breath caught, he blinked, and the shape was gone. Maybe it was never there. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But the instinct didn't lie. It whispered the same truth it had whispered in LBL. Some things step into your life only once, but they stay with you forever. The investigator tried to tell himself that the shape he'd seen in the tree line was nothing, a shadow, a trick of the fading light, the branches shifting in the breeze. That's what he wanted to believe. What any rational person would believe. But instinct is older than reason. An instinct told him something had changed, not that the creature had followed him home. He didn't believe that. LBL wasn't a thing that wandered. It was a thing that ruled its territory. And whatever lived in those woods didn't need to track people across states. It didn't need to step into neighborhoods or suburbia. But the encounter had opened something in him, a door, a sensitivity, a frequency he could suddenly hear. Something had woken up inside him the night he saw those yellow-green eyes watching him through the beams of his headlights. A recognition, a connection he didn't want but couldn't shake. And now, even far from the forest, even safe in his own home, he felt it humming at the edge of his awareness. Not a presence, a memory with teeth. He tried to move on, go back to his normal routines, pretend he wasn't waiting for something, pretend the woods weren't still inside him, carved into the back of his mind with clawed precision. But then small things began happening. Nothing dramatic. Nothing he could photograph or prove, just the kind of details that feel meaningless on their own, until they start forming a pattern. Twice he found muddy streaks on the side of his truck, higher than he could explain. One morning his dog, normally bold, fearless, refused to go outside and whined at the door like something was already out there. A raccoon carcass appeared on his lawn, not ripped open but crushed, like something had clamped down on it with a bite force no wild animal in that area possessed. Neighbors heard coyotes howling at strange hours, but not like normal howls, longer, deeper, almost shaped. He told himself not to jump to conclusions. Not everything strange is supernatural. Not everything unexplained is connected. But he couldn't shake the feeling that LBL had followed him in the only way it could. In his mind, in his senses, and in his dreams. One night he jolted awake again, but this time he wasn't sweating, and his heart wasn't racing. He just opened his eyes, calmly, because he felt something. Not a nightmare, not fear, a shift in the air. He sat up and realized the room was silent again. The same dense silence he had felt in the forest. The silence that felt like a presence, like a held breath. He got out of bed slowly, his movements instinctively quiet, careful. He walked to the window and peered out at the empty street. Nothing. And yet the silence stayed heavy. He realized then that the silence wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from him. The world wasn't going quiet. He was listening differently now. Listening the way you listen when you know a predator exists. Listening the way you listen when you've seen something you aren't meant to see. He stared into the darkness until his reflection blurred against the glass. And then, softly and slowly, something clicked into place in his mind. One simple thought, one truth he had avoided acknowledging since the moment he left LBL. He hadn't escaped anything. You don't escape something that isn't chasing you. You don't outrun something that doesn't need to move to reach you. You don't leave behind a creature that has lived in the human imagination long before science tried to erase it. He whispered into the dark room as if saying it out loud would make it less real. It knows I saw it. And the moment the words left his mouth, he knew what the next step had to be. He wasn't going back to LBL out of curiosity, not for closure, not for answers. He was going back because he finally understood what had been gnawing at him since the encounter. Some places don't let you walk away without finishing the story. He sat down on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. They weren't shaking anymore. He felt calm, unsettlingly calm, because he knew where the story led next, and he knew what waited for him in those woods. He whispered again, softer this time. It's time. He didn't tell anyone he was going back, not because he feared they'd judge him, but because he knew deep down there was no version of this trip that didn't end with danger, maybe even death, and he didn't want anyone trying to stop him. He packed, lightly, just a small bag, flashlight, batteries, a knife he knew was useless but brought anyway, and a camera, more for proof than protection. He drove alone, the highway stretching ahead like a dark river. Each mile he covered felt like peeling back layers of safety he'd spent weeks rebuilding. Every sign pointing toward Kentucky tightened something in his chest. The closer he got to LBL, the heavier the air grew. He crossed into Grand Rivers just before dusk. The same little stores, the same gas stations, the same diner where the cashier had warned him. But something felt different. People looked at him differently, or maybe he only imagined it, maybe he was projecting. But when he stepped inside a convenience store to buy water, The clerk behind the counter froze. "You're back." Not a question, a statement. He didn't respond. The clerk took a breath, walked closer, lowered his voice. "You shouldn't go in there. Not tonight." He swallowed. "Why tonight?" The man shook his head. "It's just not a good night." The way he said it didn't feel mystical. It felt practical, like he was talking about weather conditions that had nothing to do with clouds. He left without answering, got back in his truck, and drove toward the bridge. The moment he crossed it, the world changed again. Not visually, nothing obvious, but the air grew still, like stepping into a sealed room. Even the engine sounded quieter. As the road carried him deeper into the forest, the feeling from before returned, the pressure, the weight, the awareness. But this time he didn't fight it. He let it settle over him. The trace stretched long and dark, the trees arching overhead like the ribs of a massive animal. He drove slowly, eyes scanning every gap between the trunks. His headlights cut through the night in two pale beams. He wasn't looking for the creature. He was waiting for it. At the turnoff for Demumber's Bay, he stopped. This was where everything had started. The chase, the eyeshine, the sense of something massive moving just out of sight. But he didn't turn down the road. Not yet. Instead, he sat there with the engine idling, staring into the black corridor of trees. The forest waited, patient, unhurried. A soft breeze scraped through the branches, then stilled. The silence fell again. That same suffocating silence, the absolute absence of life, and it washed over him like cold water dumping straight down his spine. He turned off the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening. No crickets, no leaves, no wind, nothing. Just the forest breathing around him. He stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under his boots. Even that noise felt too loud, like the sound was intruding somewhere. It wasn't meant to exist. He took a few steps toward the tree line. His flashlight stayed off. He wanted his eyes to adjust. He wanted the darkness to meet him halfway. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a branch snapped. Not fallen, broken clean, deliberate. He didn't move. Another snap, closer. A heavy shift of weight on dry leaves. A slow exhale that wasn't wind. The forest wasn't empty. It had never been empty. Something was circling him. He turned his head slowly, scanning the shadows. Shapes merged into each other, difficult to parse. Every tree felt like it could hide something tall enough to stand behind it. He felt it before he saw it, a presence, a pressure, a change in the air density, like something huge had slipped between him and the rest of the world. Then, two eyes appeared in the darkness, not glowing, reflecting, yellow-green, like a predator built for night. Too high off the ground, too far apart, they blinked once, and the forest went dead still. His breath caught in his throat. His pulse slowed, not sped up, slowed, as if his body understood it was prey and didn't want to draw attention to itself. He lifted his flashlight. It didn't matter. Before he even turned it on, the eyes disappeared. Not gone. Hidden. Waiting. He whispered into the darkness, voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "I'm here." A sound answered him, not a growl, not a howl. A low, resonant rumble, like a warning echoing through the trees. It vibrated through the ground and up his legs. He raised the flashlight, clicked it on, and swept the beam across the forest floor. Nothing. But the presence didn't fade. It shifted, moved, repositioned, like it was studying him from a new angle. He understood then what had been haunting him since the first encounter. It wasn't that he had seen the creature, it was that the creature had seen him, recognized him, remembered him. And this time, it wasn't hunting. It was assessing, measuring, deciding what he was. He felt the truth settle into him like cold metal. He wasn't in danger because he was in the creature's territory. He was in danger because the creature was no longer afraid of being seen. Something cracked in the trees behind him. He spun around. The eyes were there again, closer, lower, watching him from behind a fallen log. Then, a second pair of eyes blinked beside them. His stomach dropped. There wasn't one. There were two. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Two sets of eyes watched him from behind the log, one slightly higher than the other. Both unblinking, perfectly steady predators. Didn't stare like that unless they were certain, unless they were in control, unless they weren't threatened by what they were looking at. He forced himself not to move. Predators react to movement. They react to fear. They react to prey. He kept his hands loose at his sides, his breathing slow, his posture neutral. Another branch snapped deeper in the forest. A third one. He didn't dare turn his head, but he understood immediately. He wasn't surrounded by two creatures, he was surrounded by many. Not a pack in the way wolves hunt together, but a pattern, a formation, a measured spacing in the dark. Coordinated, intelligent, purposeful. He didn't know how he knew that, he just did. Something shifted behind him, so softly he barely caught it. A subtle footfall, a controlled exhale. He knew better than to turn around. But every instinct screamed that if he didn't, he'd never have a second chance. He pivoted slowly, the air felt thicker, the trees swayed without wind, and then he saw it, standing halfway between the trunks, tall enough that its ears brushed a low branch, its shoulders broad enough to blot out the starlight behind it. The one from the ravine, the one whose eyes he'd met before. The one he'd hoped, he'd imagined. It stepped forward once, not aggressive, not hesitant, assessing him the same way a human sizes up another human. He whispered, barely audible, "You remember me." The creature's chest expanded with a long, slow inhale. A test, a measure, a decision. He felt something shift again. This time inside himself, because the fear he expected didn't come. Instead, something else rose up. Something primal. Something ancient. Something humans had forgotten they were capable of feeling. Not terror, recognition. A distant, buried memory of a world where humans were not the top of the food chain, where the rules of survival weren't written in books or labs, where creatures like this existed openly, unchallenged. The dogman huffed softly, an exhale that sent a thin cloud of mist curling from its snout. The other eyes in the forest didn't move, didn't blink, didn't step forward. They were waiting for him to react. He understood the unspoken message. This wasn't a random encounter. This was an evaluation. He took a breath and raised his flashlight, then slowly lowered it. He didn't shine it in their faces. He didn't challenge them with light. He didn't break the standoff. He simply held it at his side. Something changed in the creature's posture, small but noticeable. A shift from threat to acknowledgement. The dogman moved closer, closing half the distance with 2 quiet, controlled steps. Its movement was fluid, unnatural, almost cinematic, too smooth for something so large. The smell hit him next. Not rot, not death, not animal musk, earth, pine, wet soil, old bark, rain-soaked fur, the smell of something that belonged to the forest in a way no human ever could. He whispered, "What are you?" The creature tilted its head slightly, as if studying the intention behind the words, rather than the words themselves. Then, a howl echoed far in the distance. Not the creature in front of him, another one. Farther away, deeper in the forest, calling. The dogman's ears twitched. The eyes behind the log shifted. Something moved to his right. The signal had been sent, and whatever decision had been made, it didn't involve him dying tonight. The tall one stepped back into the shadows. The 2 behind the log blinked out next. Then the rest, 1 pair of eyes at a time, vanished like candles snuffed out. No rustling, no footsteps, no retreating branches, just absence. Until he was standing alone in a silence so complete, it felt like the forest had swallowed sound itself. He didn't move for a long time. Finally, he whispered, "Thank you." Something answered him. Not words. A distant, heavy thud on the forest floor, like a creature landing after dropping from a high branch. A reminder. They were gone, but not far. He walked backward toward his truck, refusing to turn his back on the darkness. When he reached the door, he slid inside, locked it, and started the engine. Only then did he realize his hands were steady, not shaking, not trembling, calm, because something had changed tonight. Something fundamental. The dogman wasn't just a creature wandering the forest. It wasn't just a predator, avoiding human contact. It wasn't just a cryptid lost between folklore and biology. It was a guardian. Not of humans, not of towns, not of borders or laws or land. A guardian of the forest itself. A keeper of something older than names and older than nations. And he had stepped into its territory and been allowed to leave. But as he drove away, one truth settled deep into his bones. He wasn't done with LBL, and LBL wasn't done with him. Driving away from the forest didn't feel like leaving it. The headlights cut through the darkness. The tires hummed against the pavement. The bridge back to Grand Rivers came into view, but it was as if the trees were still watching him in the mirrors. He kept checking the rear view anyway, not because he expected to see eyes glowing behind him, but because he felt like something wanted him to look back. The road signs, the street lights, even the gas station canopy, all of it felt too bright, too artificial, too clean, as if he had stepped out of one world and into another that had no idea what lived on the other side of that tree line. He pulled into the parking lot outside his motel, killed the engine, and sat still for a long time. His partner broke the silence first. "You know what this means," He didn't answer. Because the truth wasn't simple. It wasn't clear. It wasn't even safe to speak out loud. Seeing something impossible forces you into a corner. Either pretend you didn't see it, or accept that the world is bigger, darker, and older than anyone admits. He looked at his partner. "It's not just a creature," he said. "It's organized." His partner nodded, and we weren't the first to see it. That was the part that kept clawing at his mind. The way locals shut down, the way the bait shop owner ordered him out, the way the sheriff's deputy whispered, "Drop this." The way every ranger acted like their job was to survive the woods, not protect them. They weren't confused. They weren't skeptical. They were protecting a secret, and not a small one. He went back to his room and showered, but he couldn't wash off the feeling that he had stepped into something he wasn't meant to find. Not a legend, not folklore, not even a cryptid, a boundary, a border, a line drawn by something with authority. He sat down on the motel bed and opened his laptop. He didn't even know what he was looking for. Newspapers, forgotten logs, biological surveys, missing persons reports. But the deeper he dug, the stranger the pattern became. There were hundreds of missing persons in federal lands across the U.S. Sure, everyone knew that. But in LBL, too many cases were marked with vague terminology. Animal attack, unknown circumstances, environmental factors, no further information. Some files were barely a paragraph long. Some had been edited. Some had disappeared entirely. One case from the mid-90s had an attached statement from a ranger, a single line. Advise, notifiable only to central office, no local dissemination. Another case from 2003 ended abruptly. Incident resolved, no public hazard. Resolved how? By whom? What hazard? The deeper he went, the clearer it became. The beast of LBL wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a town legend. It was something the government handled quietly. So quietly that most people never knew anything had happened. He pushed farther, digging through archived maps, old satellite images, forest management records. And then he found something that felt like a punch to the stomach. Aerial surveys from the 1960s, before LBL was officially created. At first glance, they looked normal. Tree canopy, river systems, rural homesteads. But then he saw the restricted zones. Not labeled as restricted back then, just marked with thick pencil circles and the word "no clearance." No explanation, no coordinates, no legend. And every single one of those circles matched the same places where campers went missing, rangers refused to patrol, locals warned visitors not to go, and sightings had been reported for decades. The most chilling discovery was buried in a scanned memo from 1964. A typewritten sentence near the bottom: predator containment protocols remain in effect until full relocation is complete. Relocation of what? There was no species listed, no animal mentioned, no region named, just predator containment. Then a handwritten note in the margin: night phase activity escalating area not suitable for civilian access. He stared at that sentence until the screen blurred. Night phase activity. That wasn't the language of biology. That wasn't the language of wildlife management. That was the language of observation. The way scientists track behavior patterns in dangerous, intelligent animals. His partner walked in. "You find anything?" He turned the laptop toward him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think LBL was chosen, not created." His partner frowned. "What do you mean?" He closed the laptop slowly. "I don't think dogmen roam the woods by accident." A long silence settled between them. "I think the forest was built around them." The air in the room felt heavy, not from danger, from understanding, from the realization that the creatures weren't intruders. They weren't invaders. They were the original inhabitants and the entire recreation area. The lakes, the clearings, the boundaries was a containment field disguised as a national park. A cage big enough to feel infinite. A territory meant to keep something powerful, isolated. But something had changed. Something was weakening. Something was shifting inside the forest. He leaned back against the wall. "They weren't trying to hide the creature from us," he murmured. "They were trying to hide us from it." And now it had stepped out of the dark, walked into the open, looked him in the eyes, and let him live. Not because it feared him, because it recognized him, because it allowed him to go. And that meant something far more terrifying. Whatever the dogmen were, whatever they were created for, whatever they were guarding, they were done staying hidden. Something was coming, and LBL was only the beginning. He didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every time he closed his eyes, the creature's silhouette burned through the dark behind his eyelids. The height, the chest, the way it leaned on the tree like a person, the way it watched, calculating, almost patient. Predators don't watch prey with patience. Predators stalk. Predators strike. But this thing evaluated him, as if deciding whether he was a threat, or whether he was worth killing, or whether killing him would interrupt something more important. He lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to push away the memory. It didn't. His partner woke early too. Neither mentioned the night. Neither mentioned LBL. Neither mentioned the thing in the trees. They just packed up their gear, checked out of the motel, and drove toward Paducah for breakfast. But the universe has a way of refusing to let you walk away from the truth. They were halfway through their meals when a man walked into the diner in a worn-out uniform jacket, sheriff's insignia. Retired. He recognized the investigator immediately. "You're the one asking about the woods," the man said quietly, sliding into the booth uninvited. The investigator tensed. His partner did too. The retired officer placed his forearms on the table, leaned forward and lowered his voice. "You need to listen very carefully, and when you're done listening, you need to go home." The investigator didn't speak. He just nodded. The officer continued. "You're not the first to see one of those things. You're not even the 100th. Rangers, deputies, hunters, trackers. We've all seen something we can't explain." He paused. "And we were all told the same thing. Stay quiet." The investigator tried to ask why, but the officer shook his head sharply. "Don't interrupt. I may not have long." He glanced over his shoulder before leaning closer. Whatever you saw in those woods, it wasn't wild, it wasn't natural, and it damn sure wasn't alone. The investigator felt a cold weight settle in his chest. You think they're breeding? He asked. The officer gave a humorless laugh. Son, they've been there longer than any of us, longer than the park, longer than the lakes. They didn't show up. We did. He took a deep breath. Back in the 80s, we got calls about screams in the old sites. Thought it was campers, thought maybe a cougar, thought maybe a homicide. His eyes hardened. It wasn't. He rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit. Federal boys came in before we could secure the scene. Black trucks, no plates, no conversation. They told us we were relieved, and that's exactly what we were. The investigator leaned forward. What happened? The officer's jaw tightened. I can't tell you details, but I can tell you this. The bodies we saw weren't killed by any animal on record. Not a bear, not a wolf, not a catamount. I've been hunting since I could walk. I know what a predator kill looks like. He shook his head. That wasn't a predator kill. That was something that knew what it was doing. The investigator swallowed. Why cover it up? The officer's stare turned cold. You ever seen a town lose its entire tourist economy in 48 hours? You ever seen a federal agency admit it can't control something living inside its own land? He paused. So no. They don't cover it up to protect us, they cover it up to protect themselves. His partner broke the silence. What exactly were they trying to contain? The officer's eyes flicked between them. You're asking the wrong question. He leaned even closer. The right question is, what happens when they stop containing it? Neither man responded. The officer continued. I'll tell you one story, and then I'm done. He looked out the diner window as if making sure nothing was listening. About 12 years ago, a hunter went missing near the north end. We searched for 4 days, found his bow broken clean in half, found drag marks leading into the trees. He paused, found what was left of him a mile away. The investigator stared at him. What do you mean, what was left? The officer shook his head. You don't want to know, but I'll tell you this. Whatever killed him didn't kill for food. He looked back at the investigator. You said you saw it staring at you, leaning on that tree, watching like it understood you. The investigator nodded once. Good, the officer said. Remember that face? Because it remembered yours? The investigator felt his stomach tighten. The officer continued. Over the years, I've learned something. Those things, they don't come after everyone. They choose, they test. And when they let you walk away? A long pause. That's not mercy. That's interest. The diner suddenly felt too small, too bright, too exposed. The officer stood, leaving cash on the table. You went into their land. You saw them. You walked away. He adjusted his jacket and lowered his voice to a whisper. That means they'll be watching you now. From a distance, maybe. But watching. He turned to leave, then looked back one last time. And remember, predators don't forget faces. He walked out without another word. The investigator sat frozen, staring at the door long after it closed. His partner finally spoke. We're not done with this, are we? The investigator didn't answer because he knew the truth. You don't finish a story like this, you don't wrap it up. You don't walk away, not when something in the woods has looked into your eyes and decided you were worth noticing, not when containment lines were failing, not when dogmen were stepping out of myth and back into the world, not when every instinct in your body whispered the same message. This isn't a legend. This is a beginning. And whatever lives in LBL has started to move. For days after leaving the woods, that thought wouldn't leave him. It followed him through every town, into every conversation, beneath every quiet mile of highway. No matter how far he drove, the feeling stayed with him. A weight in his chest, a pressure behind his ribs, the sense that something was still watching, something that hadn't finished with him. He told himself he was done. He told himself he'd seen enough. But curiosity works like gravity in places like LBL. It pulls you back, even when you know better. He returned to the outskirts of the preserve, not deep inside it, not back to the trace, just close enough to see the tree line again. Close enough to convince himself that he wasn't going back in, that he only needed closure, not answers. But the forest didn't look quiet anymore. It looked aware, like the trees themselves had shifted closer to the road. He slowed the car, not because he wanted to stop, but because something else made him. A presence, a shadow, a figure. Someone was standing near one of the gated service paths. A lone man in a uniform, hands on his belt, staring into the woods the same way he had the night of the encounter. A ranger. The investigator pulled over without knowing why. Maybe instinct, maybe fate, maybe because every question he'd carried since that day suddenly had a direction. He stepped out of the car. The ranger didn't move, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him at all. He wasn't supposed to meet the ranger, not officially, not on paper. The man had retired years earlier, and every attempt to find him through the park system hit the same dead end. No forwarding information, no further contact. But people in small towns don't disappear completely. Not really. Especially not a man who had spent 30 years patrolling the deepest parts of a forest. Most people were too afraid to enter. The investigator found him behind an old hardware store in a folding chair, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. His hair was white, his posture straight, his eyes sharp in a way that suggested he had learned to never stop paying attention. When the investigator introduced himself, the ranger didn't speak. He just studied him, long enough to make the silence hurt. Then he nodded once. You saw it. Not a question, a statement. The investigator nodded. The ranger let out a breath through his nose, the sound somewhere between exhaustion and acceptance. Then sit down. You deserve the truth. The investigator sat. The ranger continued sharpening the blade while he spoke. I spent 3 decades in those woods. 30 years. I know every ridge, every hollow, every deer trail, every creek crossing. You spend that much time somewhere. You become part of it. You learn its moods, its sounds, its silences. The ranger paused. And one day, the silences start talking back. The investigator waited. The ranger lowered the knife, eyes fixed on the blade. People think rangers sit in a booth all day, not me. I was the one who went where the others wouldn't. I tracked poachers. I found lost hikers. I recovered bodies when kids got careless around the cliffs. And in all those years, I learned 2 things about LBL. He raised 2 fingers. 1. That place is older than the maps say. 2. There are parts of it no human should ever walk. The investigator leaned forward. You mean restricted zones? The ranger shook his head. No, not restricted. Avoided. He slid the knife back into its sheath. There's a difference. The investigator asked what he meant, and the ranger's gaze hardened. You think the closures are random? The trails that get shut down without explanation? The campgrounds that disappear? The sections marked environmental recovery? You think that's about conservation? He shook his head slowly. That's containment. The investigator felt a chill crawl up his spine. Containment. The ranger continued. I've seen what they do to elk, seen the carcasses, seen the way they peel the hide like they know exactly where to cut. He shook his head. No cougar does that, no coyote, and nothing that walks on 4 legs. The investigator asked him what he thought the creatures were. The ranger answered without hesitation. They're not supernatural. I'll tell you that straight. Not spirits, not demons, not shapeshifters. People like to paint it mystical because the alternative is worse. He leaned in slightly. They're real. The investigator swallowed. What are they? The ranger looked away as if searching for words that wouldn't sound insane. I don't know where they came from. Nobody does, but they're old. Older than the dams. Older than the settlers, maybe older than the tribes, and smart. He tapped his temple. Not animal smart, not instinct, intelligence, strategy. He paused. I've watched one shadow, a group of hikers for half a mile. Never showed itself, never made a sound. It waited until they crossed into another territory before it let them go. The words hung in the air. Territory, plural. The ranger lowered his voice. I've seen at least 3. Different heights, different builds, different tracks, different territories. People talk like there's one creature in those woods. That's the comfort version. He looked the investigator dead in the eyes. There's a population. The investigator felt the room tilt slightly. How many? The ranger didn't blink. Enough that they don't hide out of fear. They hide because they're good at it. He paused again, letting the weight sink in. Enough that sometimes I'd find tracks in places no one had any business being. He rubbed his hands together. And enough that the government stopped trying to kill them a long time ago. The investigator stared. What do you mean, stopped? The ranger's jaw clenched. You think the black truck started in the 80s? Hell no. We saw men in unmarked uniforms in the 60s. They came before the dams were finished. They came when locals were still living there. The investigator felt the air shift. You're saying the government knew? Knew? The ranger laughed without humor. They relocated 700 families to build a recreational area in the middle of nowhere. You think that was coincidence? They wanted control. They needed space. They needed distance. He leaned back. They needed a fence without having to call it a fence. The investigator whispered the next question. Containment of what? The ranger didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. He just stared at him with a look that said the truth was too big to fit in a sentence. Finally, he spoke. You saw one. That's why you're here. But let me tell you something you didn't see. He lifted a small lockbox from beside his chair. unlocked it, pulled out a zip bag. Inside was a single clump of fur, long, coarse, black, dusted with gray. The investigator felt his heart hammer. "Where did you get that?" The ranger looked tired. "Pulled it off a barbed wire fence in '94. Not the only sample I ever found, but the only one I kept." He held it up. "I sent a piece to a lab, private, quiet, no federal involvement." The investigator leaned closer. "What did they say?" The ranger exhaled slowly. "They said it wasn't dog, wasn't wolf, wasn't coyote, wasn't bear, wasn't anything." The investigator whispered, "So what was it?" The ranger's voice dropped to a whisper. "They said it was canid, but the genome didn't match any species known to science." The investigator felt the room tilt again. "What did they compare it to?" The ranger looked away. "That's the part that scared them. Most of the markers lined up closest with wolf, but there were anomalies, things wolves don't have." "Like what?" The ranger swallowed. "Bone density, muscle fiber ratios, thermal resistance." He hesitated. "And one sequence that suggested hybridization." The investigator blinked. "Hybrid with what?" The ranger didn't look at him when he answered. "Human." Silence, thick, heavy, suffocating. The investigator finally spoke. "You think they're engineered?" The ranger shook his head. "No, too old, too adaptive, too perfect for that land." He paused. "But I think somebody found them, and I think somebody studied them, and I think somebody decided the best way to keep the public safe was to deny everything." The investigator stared at the fur. The ranger continued, "I don't know if they were ever human, or if humans came from them, or if they're something that evolved parallel to us. But whatever they are," he pointed toward the direction of the forest, "they don't fear us. They tolerate us." A long pause. "And that is the only reason LBL still has a population." The investigator stood slowly. He felt something in him closing, like a door shutting on the last piece of disbelief he had left. The ranger watched him for a moment, then said quietly, "I'll give you one last piece of advice." The investigator waited. "Whatever you do, don't go back. Don't look for them. Don't track them. Don't chase the truth." He paused. "Because the moment you start looking for them again," a longer pause, "they'll remember you're still alive." The investigator drove away in silence. The road out of the town felt longer than the one that brought him in. The sun was setting when he finally reached the highway. Long shadows cutting across the pavement, the trees outside the window blending into a dark wall of green. He thought he'd feel relieved leaving LBL behind. He didn't. He felt something else, like the woods weren't behind him at all. Like the creature hadn't stayed where he left it. Like that moment, that one slow turn of its head, that 1 second of eye contact, had created something that now stretched between him and that forest forever. A thread, thin, invisible, unbreakable, a connection predators don't forget. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing there. But the feeling didn't fade. And as the sky darkened into night, the investigator finally understood what every local, every ranger, every old-timer had been trying to tell him since the beginning. Some places are not haunted because of ghosts. Some places are haunted because something alive refuses to die. And in the land between the lakes, some things were never meant to be found. Some things were never meant to be explained. And some things watch you long after you stop watching them. He didn't talk about LBL for months after leaving it. Not because he forgot what he saw, but because he knew he wouldn't be believed. People on the outside always think they're smarter than the story. They reduce centuries of fear to tricks of the light, misidentified bears, overactive imaginations, campfire exaggerations. It's easy to be brave from far away, but the truth about LBL doesn't live in headlines or maps or search results. It lives in the silence, in the places where animals stop moving, in the valleys where the trees lean just a little too still, in the nights when the wind dies without reason. It lives in the spaces humans were never meant to step into. Every witness describes the same feeling. Not a scream, not a howl, not teeth or claws, but awareness. A presence so old and so patient that it doesn't need to show itself to remind you it's there. He understood that now. He understood it the same way the Shawnee did, centuries before the dams, the same way settlers did when they abandoned their homesteads, the same way officers did when they vomited behind gas stations at dawn, the same way every ranger does when the radio crackles and then goes dead for no reason. Some places don't belong to people. LBL never did, and whatever lives inside it never left. Every missing camper, every shredded deer, every wild dog explanation, every local who refuses to talk, every ranger who looks over their shoulder before answering, every sighting that sounds exactly like the one before it. All of it points to the same truth. There is something walking upright in those woods, something strong enough to tear through steel, fast enough to disappear between heartbeats, smart enough to choose who lives and who doesn't, a predator that doesn't fear humans, a creature that remembers faces, a species that survived long enough to learn the shape of our ignorance. He left the land between the lakes, but the story didn't leave him. It stayed in the quiet moments, the still nights, the sudden silences, the instinct to look at the tree line even when there is no tree line. And somewhere out there, beneath those canopies of tangled branches and drowned towns, something still moves at night. Something that has learned the rhythms of humans, the same way humans once learned the rhythms of wolves. People call it DOGMAN. Others call it a legend. Some refuse to name it at all. But whether you believe the story or not doesn't matter, because belief doesn't keep you safe. Distance does. And if you ever find yourself near the lakes, driving the trace at dusk, watching the woods turn black, feeling the air go suddenly still, don't stop the car. Don't check the trees. Don't listen for footsteps. Just keep driving. Because in the land between the lakes, every silence is a warning. Every shadow is a choice. And every story ends the same way. Not with what you saw, but with what saw you.
Subscribe and walk deeper in the dark.